Hey friends, a quick note before we start. This episode was recorded 4 days before Her Royal Highness Queen Elizabeth II passed. Completely out of chance, we mention her in this episode as a part of a benign joke. We thought about cutting it out of respect, but as a Brit, I felt the joke was actually on point, speaking to her incredible 70-year reign, making her one of the most influential, if not the most influential woman of our time. To put this in perspective for our American friends, she spent time with 13 out of the last 14 sitting US presidents. As the new Prime Minister of the UK, Liz Truss described her, she was the rock upon which modern Britain was built. Queen Elizabeth was known for her genuine curiosity, especially in people, and her appreciation of humor. So, we wanted to honor her by actually keeping the line. We are sorry for our collective loss. Long live the king.
Hello.
Hi.
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 Hello.
I'm curious about
building open, authentic, loving relationship.
I'm curious about jealousy.
I'm curious about polyamory.
Does it just mean that you're fucking all the time?
How can I tell my parents that my partner is already married?
I'm curious about
How do you know when you're too busy to have another relationship?
I'm curious about dominant and subordinate relationships.
I'm curious about sexual health.
How can relationships evolve with people as they grow and change?
And one of the future generations, hopefully never going to have to unlearn a thing because we teach them correctly in the first place.
Welcome to the Curious Fox podcast, for those challenging the status quo in love, sex, and relationships. My name is Effy Blue.
And I'm Jacqueline Mislaw. And today, we're talking about the misinformation that we receive around sex and the global impact that this mis- and disinformation has. So I'm going to start with the obvious question, Effy, which is, what misinformation did you receive? What did you maybe believe to be true and then realized it was not?
I have a very clear memory of the first time I got information about sex that I knew was wrong. And it came from my mom. When I heard it, I was like, I just know. The thing that I don't remember is why I knew it was categorically wrong. I just knew it was categorically wrong.
How old were you?
Young. So I want to put myself around like 10. Right. And I was a naughty child. I want to rephrase that. I was a curious child, which to the untrained eye looks naughty.
Right. Those trying to maintain the status quo would call you naughty.
Would call me naughty. I was merely curious and I just wanted to find things out. And one of the ways that I would do this, I would sneak these comic books, adult comic books from the newspaper stand. There was one right underneath our apartment building and my mom had an account with them and we'd buy papers and everything throughout the month, and she would pay them at the end of the month, and then it was my job to go down and get it every morning. And I would sneak, which is very naughty and it is stealing. I know it's bad, but that was the only way that I could get them because no one would allow me to have them. I would slip one of those comics into one of the newspapers and then sneak them out. And then as I went upstairs, before I went into the house, I would roll it and put it down my clothes or up my clothes. And then I would just bring the newspaper home. And that was my access. And these were naughty adult comics, cartoons. And one of the cartoons I had would keep making reference to condoms. And there was little pictures of them. And these are comics, right? So they were using them as a metaphor for something. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't on the nose. But there was kept referring to these idea of condoms. And then I asked her what a condom was, and she gave me this vague answer that she said something like, it would go on my dad so there wouldn't be any disease, is kind of what she said, which was really vague. And that was the only comment. And then we moved on from that. And I was like, okay. So I think from there, I just went into a spiral around, what does that even mean? And I'm sure it's pre-internet. I'm sure I did some sleuthing. There was Encyclopedia Britannica in the house. No doubt I looked in there. I used to look in there for everything. And that was my first sort of contact with my mom about sex, and it was over condoms. And then the next time I spoke to her is what I knew where the misinformation was. She came into my room. I was older at this point. Now I'm putting myself around 17, because that's the first time I started having sex. So 17. And then she came in and I was having sex at the time and I had condoms under my pillow. And then she just came into my room sat down on my bed, and she didn't knock. It's just boundaries issues. That's where my boundary issues stem from. And I was like, oh wow, okay, I know there are condoms on the bed. And then she just talking to me, and she took my pillow from the head side, and she took it away from there to put her head on it. She wanted to talk to me and lie on my bed at the same time. And if she did, she revealed the box of condoms. And I was like, whoa, awkward. And I reached for the condoms and I grabbed them. I threw them under the bed and I was like, okay. And then at that point she said, oh, wow, I saw those. And I was like, okay, well, you should be proud of me. And then she said, you know what? You need to wear them 2 at a time to make sure that you don't get a disease. And at that point I was like, did you just say I should wear 2 condoms at the same time? And that was the first time I heard my mom be like, I know for a fact that you're not supposed to put 2 condoms on top of each other. That's a myth. That is wrong. At that point, she was, in her 40s, 50s, had a child. To that point, she thought wearing 2 condoms was the safest thing to do. And that was my first sex myth.
Yeah. I mean, my mom would have had a very different reaction, but I think I do think that at the end of the day, I don't know actually if any information would have come out of it. I was thinking about what misinformation has existed for me. And of course, the very obvious, Jesus will leave me behind if I ever do anything. So in the midst of adolescent masturbation, a huge fear that whilst that was happening would be the second coming and I would be left behind. That, and I would watch late at night. I was also kind of a curious child and would be watching Cinemax or HBO movies late into the night, which would often show sex. And my vulva did not look like the vulva of the people on screen. And so, but those 2 things I've talked about both on the show. I think one thing that I may not have talked about that I think was a myth for me was that the only thing that was considered sex and losing my virginity was penetrative sex. And so, hard penis, wet vagina. And so I was highly protective of that, but in its stead would engage in things like oral sex, which felt much more intimate than I was prepared for, right? I was protecting my vagina, but not my mouth. And so that didn't make sense at all.
Yeah, I heard of that. I mean, that myth made it to me too. A friend of mine was telling me how she was having anal sex to make sure that she was still a virgin when she got married. Oh my God. I was shocked to my core. At the time I was, again, a curious child. I was ahead of my year on this the kind of information. Knowing what I knew and knowing that's what she was doing, I was gobsmacked. Absolutely shocked in terror. And then she told me that's what people did. And at the time I was away from my home culture and going to a school in another country, and to learn that there was like a group of people and that was the thing to do to have anal sex before your regular penis vagina sex to save your virginity was shocking to me. Shocking.
Yeah, that. So all sorts of other things happening, but as long as that penis did not enter into a vagina, we were all okay. Everything was going to be okay.
Wow.
I think what was also challenging is, which is very true, I think, for women in general, is the standing on the line between I am a virgin, I am a virgin, I am to be respected, I'm a good girl, and I'm not a virgin, and I'm not a dork, and I'm not a loser, and all the things that were associated with that. And so there's this weird line where you're like supposed to be a virgin, but also not supposed to be a virgin. And so I think that all of those things in the in-between was the gray area. We're like, okay, so I've technically, according to the definition I have not been. I remember having conversations with friends about just the tip. And I remember her talking about that and saying, well, it was just the tip, so it didn't count. I know.
It's a tight rope. Like what you're describing is such a tight rope that you have to walk on. That on one side, you're a virgin and you're pure and you're good and, well-behaved and compliant. And on the other,
not a slut, not promiscuous, not even as a high schooler. Yes.
Right. And on the other side, you're you're bad, you're cool, like you're doing all the things, but then you're a slut and all that kind of stuff. Right. There's such a fine line that society puts us on to figure this stuff out. And that in itself is a stupid myth.
Yeah.
funnily enough, the place that I busted most myths and really got to learn real sex, of course, I've mentioned it before, have been sex parties for me. See real people having real sex with people who understand their pleasure, seeking their pleasure, navigating their pleasure, telling people, new friends, strangers, how to navigate their pleasure, developing language around that, all that kind of stuff I actually learned going to sex parties. And which I, always recommend to people, go to sex parties, find good ones, go. But if you can't go, there are also other places where we can bust some of these myths. And we're going to actually talking to somebody who's doing that, right? Who dedicated a lot of time, energy, effort into busting some of these myths.
That's right. And we have a special guide to help us through this conversation today.
Hello, I'm Sophia Smith Galer. I'm a journalist, author, and TikTok creator based in London.
We were introduced to Sophia on TikTok alongside her 400,000 followers. Her videos have been viewed over 100 million times. She was named on Forbes 30 Under 30 list for 2022. In 2021, she won Innovation of the Year for her TikTok journalism at the British Journalism Awards. And Vogue recently named her on their list of 25 most influential women in the UK.
Alongside Her Royal Highness, Queen Elizabeth II, no less.
Yeah, it's a good list.
Yeah, it's a good list. I never want to be on a list, but I want to be on that list next to the Queen. Yes, please.
I love the idea that the Queen and her folks are looking at the list and seeing who else is on the list and then reading about Sophia's work. I think that's fantastic. And I love it.
Love that. Her book, Losing It, Sex Education for the 21st Century, is a reminder that even in 2022, we are still living the shadow of these myths that have been around for centuries. Mm-hmm. It is surprising to me, but it is where we are. And I really appreciate her effort in trying to continue to fight this misinformation, disinformation out there. So we started first asking her the question, what exactly is misinformation and disinformation?
Yeah, so misinformation is a word that maybe in the past we didn't hear that much about. And we hear it increasingly because we're all getting a bit more literate about spotting and debunking misinformation in different parts of society. So you might have used it as a word being used when there are political elections and you hear about one party or one candidate trying to misinform the public. In this case, that would be disinformation. Misinformation. People don't always know that they're passing on information that isn't entirely accurate. We're also used to hearing misinformation being used around the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, and people saying, oh, actually, this piece of information you've heard talking about some cure is actually not remotely evidence-based, for example. We have not heard sex misinformation really as a phrase, not heard things like gender misinformation as a phrase, but any journalist and anyone in our field, right, would straight away tell you that there is so much misinformation on and offline about sex. And in some cases, as my book charts, disinformation, which is the active, mindful attempt to give someone information that is not based on fact and that is inaccurate. And is usually done so to support their aims or their agenda rather than support the one true agenda, which is one of evidence-based truth. So I'm a journalist. I combat misinformation every day as part of my job to the point that I don't call it that. My job's just to kind of hold power to account, or it's to cover stories which are underreported, issues which deserve more attention and indeed action, often from people with power. So it was quite natural for me to start looking into this and identify a sex misinformation crisis. And then once you identify that, the second thing you find is, hang on, not only is no one really talking about this, no one's really doing anything on a proper institutional level to fight it and end it. So this book is a kind of call to arms to say that this is what happens when you under-prioritize and underfund and under-support sex education around the world. You end up with a vacuum of knowledge that leaves all of us vulnerable to misinformation. And what does this misinformation do? So each chapter charts a different piece of sex misinformation, a different sex myth, the harms that are caused by it, the people who suffer, the people who profit, and what the true story is.
Mm-hmm.
Love that.
I imagine that there are certain things that particular bits of misinformation that led you to want to do this exploration, do this deep dive, write this book. Interested in what sparked that. And also, as you were doing the research, were there pieces of information that emerged for you even, and you realized, oh, I've either been misinformed or have been told information intentionally that is not true?
Of course. So the main thing I learned from writing the book was that my assumption beforehand was, well, yeah, loads of people, I know from personal experience, loads of people get things wrong, right? I know from friend stories and I know from things in the news that there's a lot of misinformation. It must be because no one's done any research. It must be because we simply don't know enough about this particular issue. And then I talked to all these experts. I spent all these hours on like Google Scholar and trying to get to grips with all of the research on each topic I tackle. And there's so much. Of course, there are some areas that are under research. There's no denying that, especially when it comes to the health of people with vaginas and vulvas. That's enormously under researched. But time and time again, I actually found a plethora of information. So the problem is not so much always that there's not been any research, but more that the right, accurate information has not trickled down to the layperson. And that is a huge problem that can't only be solved by science communicators. It can't only be solved by the researchers themselves who already have so much, already don't have enough resources or time to kind of think about how can I Instagram story or TikTok my latest paper that's taken up so much energy and time. It really demands response from lots of different areas of society and mass media. The reason I wrote this book and the reason I first started thinking of, whoa, there are loads of sex myths and they need debunking, is a mixture of being a journalist, but also just being me, like growing up and the kind of difficulties I faced and the kind of stories that I heard from my friends. So growing up, I went to like an all-girls school. You can imagine the kind of stories that travel around an all-girls school, where not only were there any boys to perhaps counter some of the things we believed in, but my sex education program was really quite poor. In the United Kingdom, like in many other countries around the world, our national curriculum focuses on risk mitigation. And we had a prime minister who really introduced and emphasized like a teenage pregnancy strategy to lower teenage pregnancy rates in the UK. And it's left us with this obsession with condoms and this obsession with don't get pregnant and don't get an STI. And gradually, for lots of schools in the United Kingdom, what's been added to that is kind of don't get raped, don't rape someone, like really moralistic kind of language and like scaremongering language that focuses on assault and grievous sexual violence. So lots of us don't get any information on, okay, what does it look like when it's good? Like what does sex look like when it's a healthy sexual scenario or a healthy relationship? What does any of that look like? I didn't really get any information on that. What I got information on was, use a condom, and here endeth the conversation. I had one external speaker come in, and it wasn't even a particularly religious school. In fact, it was an Anglican school, but for whatever reason, we had a Catholic speaker come in, and she said to us, every time you have sex, you will lose your special glue. And if you lose all your special glue, like no husband will love you. That messaging that I would have heard, I can't quite remember how old I would have been. I was old and intelligent enough to think, that's not right. That doesn't sound legit. But I was young and impressionable enough to let it have an effect on me, to let it have an impact on what I thought my future sex life was going to look like. And what I may have beforehand seen as a neutral sex life looked at now as, oh, is this like promiscuity? Is this going to have, are people and am I going to make a moral judgment over how many people I have sex with? Those ideas get introduced to us so early on, and an educational setting should be where that's kind of ripped apart, where social and gender scripts are examined and the cracks are shown in them for how damaging they can be for all of us. And instead it was reinforced. I would go on as a young woman to have messaging like this really affect my early sexual maturity, to the point that I was completely underprepared for the realities of sexual relationships and scenarios, the realities of interactions and kind of how to deal with them. I obviously wanted to have sex, but there were instances, for example, in which I didn't know I could withdraw consent. So now, if you're in a good school, hopefully you get taught about consent withdrawal, and that consent is based on a series of interactions. And at any point that you feel like the scenario changes, you can withdraw it. No one told me that. I thought it was a one-time thing that you cashed in. And my first sexual experience was that I would have withdrawn myself from it had I known I was able to. I was told myths like sex should be painful. I believed in all the myths around virginity and the hymen, and that sex was penetrative. I knew absolutely nothing about clitoral stimulation or what pleasure looked like for people with clitorises. And it was a combination of kind of all of this that led to me developing a psychosexual disorder called vaginismus. And in the book, I talk about the really long-winded, miserable attempts to get a diagnosis and treatment for that. Luckily, it's now 10 years later, I was able to almost self-treat, and I now more or less don't have it anymore. But these personal experiences shaped how I feel like a victim of sex misinformation. I feel like a victim of under-prioritized sex education. And the minute you start interviewing people about it, so many of us feel the same. And then if you look at the data, let's take, for example, nationally representative studies that have been done in the United Kingdom. 40% of young women and 26% of young men don't feel that their first time happened at the right time. And 1 in 5 young women were not as equally willing as their partners their first time. Statistics like that should horrify us. Statistics like that suggest really negative sexual health outcomes for lots of people right at the beginning of their sexual maturity, which we know again from research is likely to lead to lower sexual function down the line if your sort of early experiences are negative rather than positive. So yeah, it was a mix of understanding I wasn't the only one, that loads of us kind of have our own stories or interactions. And we all, however, have the same refrain, which is, why didn't you teach us better? Why aren't you teaching us better now as adults? Now I'm going to be a lifelong learner. No, hopefully I'll have sex the rest of my life. There's plenty still to learn. And there's plenty of misinformation many of us still carry. When are we going to get a chance to unlearn that? And when are the future generations hopefully never going to have to unlearn a thing because we teach them correctly in the first place?
We talk about sex as a hobby on the show because of exactly what you're saying. There's just so much to learn, and there's so much to explore, and there's so much fun to be had. There is a way of looking at sex as this like endless exploration and discovery and adventure, and hopefully with the right information out there, it is a fun adventure that you get to learn about yourself, your partner, the experience itself, that it is a beautiful, rich experience for everyone. But I do agree with you. I think there are so many myths out there. I'm curious to why you think there's so much misinformation and disinformation out there. What purpose do you think is serving?
This is such a good question. I think that from the myths that I address in the book, in many cases, belief in these myths supports a status quo that often supports patriarchy. And despite calls for gender equality across the world, some places are doing better than others in seeing sex myths end where they live. So a great example of that would be how virginity testing may be banned in some countries, and in other places, they're not only not banned, but they might be supported by state systems also engaging in them. Today, while I'm covering a news story of femicides in the Middle East, for example, a story I covered of a woman who had been killed by someone who had harassed her for a really, really long time, had proposed to her, she'd rejected it. She'd gone to the police to try and get support for it, and no one really helped her. This is a young woman in Egypt. Her autopsy involved a virginity test, and subsequent media reports about her murder focus on the virginity test. Actually, they should probably be focusing on increasing femicide rates in the Middle East, which this summer is suggesting, because there've simply been so many. That is a state and judicial system still using virginity testing. So of course you're still going to have members of the population believing that this completely pseudoscientific, evidence lacking practice isn't pseudoscientific. You're going to believe it has medical scientific validity. So that's an example of how loads of them are upheld. I think we also know from in the book when I explored the consent myth, and I wrote the book in 2021. We knew about kind of masculine, like bro podcasts already at that point, but I think they've really reached a higher level in conversation at the minute because of Andrew Tate and figures like that. But I listened to this podcast that obviously didn't care that much about consenting female partners and was really focused on just how can you convince women to sleep with you. And I think in that instance, persuading and coercing, because for those individuals involved is conceived as a way where they're going to get what they want, they wouldn't really have time for the sort of reading the chapter I've written because it doesn't suit what they want. And so this comes down to quite a hyper individualized level as well of if you really, really want something and you really, really feel pressure to do something, are you going to care that actually it's not the most ethical thing to do? Are you going to care that actually you think you're being like persuasive or romantic and actually it's coercive? Like, do you really care? And how do we help you to understand how serious something is when you've been socialized by the world around you to think it's not serious or to think that what's the big deal? So the running theme, I guess, for why there is so much of it is because in so many of the scenarios, it's sanctioned by different places. Even in the sexlessness chapter, where I talk about asexuality and how as an orientation, it's not considered as an orientation by loads of spaces. You have, in this instance, lots of people who are medically trained pathologizing people who identify as asexual, saying that instead they have a libido problem or that they could be a hormone or a kind of chemical imbalance. And actually, no, that's just the way that they are. And it's great that they're the way that they are. Like, it's great that I'm the way that I am, kind of thing. In all these instances, it's often sanctioned by a place that hasn't really done the work to remove the idea.
That makes so much sense. One of the components, I'm curious that, sex sells, right? We use sex to sell everything. So having sex a little out of reach makes it a powerful force to feed capitalism on some level. And I think informed individuals that are in charge of their pleasure, aware of their sort of physicality around sexuality, and have the power to say yes or no because of the consent practices, kind of takes power away from sex as something that can be used as well. And I think that might have something to do as well. That's definitely something that I think about. Like, if we're all informed about sex, we know our bodies, we understand our pleasure, we feel we are empowered to say yes or no and explore and at a pace that we want to explore, that puts us in charge. So the visuals of sex or the sex that is used to sell us things aren't that exciting because we can tell the difference between that and, I guess, the access that we have to our own sexuality. And the difference from that kind of takes the power away from sex as used as something that sells us things.
Definitely. I think you're really onto something there. I also think that keeping sex a taboo subject is very useful for people who do not want this power structure to change. If you tell people it's taboo, you're going to keep people like me quiet. You're not going to have me say, blah, 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 there are loads of sex myths. I was actually once told by a colleague that writing a book like this would have implications for my career. And I don't believe that was an attempt to stop me writing it, but it was one to kind of, what implications can this have when I'm talking about our health, our happiness, and our human rights? What implications other than good ones are going to come out of this? I really couldn't believe I was being told that by someone who, in every other regard, is very smart and very kind. And I also think that when you debunk sex myths, the people who have most to benefit, because the sex myths do the most harm to these groups, are generally the marginalized. Women are generally way more perniciously affected by sex myths than men. That's not to say there aren't any that affect men. I'm talking about numbers here. You know, if you are from the LGBT plus community, you are far more likely to be a victim of sex myths and not have had your sexual rights as fully respected as those who are heterosexual. If you debunk sex myths, the people who've historically been disenfranchised from their sexual rights and from their human rights suddenly get them and are empowered to keep hold of them in the face of residual offense from those who've historically had power. So that is possibly another reason why certain power holders do not wish to relinquish what they have.
You shared a little bit about some of the myths that you learned about and written about in terms of myths around virginity and virility and consent and sexlessness. And I'm wondering if you can tell us more about those. Can you talk a little bit more about the misinformation that exists and the consequences that misinformation has?
So I've already alluded a little to the first myth that I debunk in the book, which is virginity, because the first time we have sex becomes mythologized when we're young people and we're learning about sex. I still have a Google alert up from when I was writing the book for virginity. So whenever a news article is written, including that word, I read it in the English language. And we think we live in a liberal world, but it remains so fetishized. It remains something that still really fascinates people. It remains something that in other parts of the world literally kills people because they are told by their culture that they need to remain a virgin until they marry. And for whatever reason, they're deemed no longer that. And so thus face social consequences. In the book, I look at how in some places around the world, virginity is still something that is considered an ideal quality in a wife, in a bride, and how this is reflected in bride prices. In the book, I speak to somebody who sold her virginity using a website at online auction and the mistreatment that she went through this whole process where she originally felt empowered in what she was doing. And then as the process kind of went through, realized, oh, hang on a minute, you can argue, how can one consent to having sex when they have never had it? It kind of raised all these thoughts for me that I'd never really considered prior to writing the book, having that conversation with her. I immediately explored the hymen myth and the tightness myth, which both kind of come out of the virginity myth. Because if you start associating this value with virginity, whether it's the value that you need to keep it and guard it and like save yourself, or whether your society believes in the value of, oh my God, it's so lame that you're a virgin, you need to get rid of that. That's still a value. So lots of places are like, oh, we don't care about virginity anymore. No, you do. You just care about it a little bit differently. I then take that to look at how for lots of women's first times, we're given this idea around the hymen that can really terrify us into thinking that sex is going to be painful, terrify us into expecting blood, or into accepting blood or accepting painful sex when that is not remotely what first time sex nor any time sex should be like. Tightness, how the language of tightness and how many of us are socialized to understand that people's anatomy looks and feels different depending on their sexual history and activity, which is just, again, none of this is evidence-based. None of this is backed up by science. And yet these myths proliferate. Many of these myths were reinforced to me by the people closest to me, like people I respected and trust. I once heard a man who in every other aspect I respected and fancied talking about a former sexual partner, saying that it felt like they were throwing a sausage down a corridor. I remember being at high school and a girl being called a bucket because she was deemed to be having sex, essentially have had sex with too many boys than was deemed socially acceptable. And you hear this kind of stuff at school, or you hear it during pillow talk, and you just think, oh, wow, I didn't know that. That must be the way it is because I trust the person who's saying it to me, or they know more than I do. And with sex, it's a common thing. Lots of us, especially early on in our sexual maturity, we often assume other people actually know way more than they do. their expertise is nothing more than, yeah, maybe they've had sex a couple more times than we have. And especially when we're a teenage, we really think like, oh my God, they're gurus, they're experts, they know everything. And it's like, nope, they're not a doctor, are they? Or they're not a psychotherapist. Are they actually giving me accurate information? And then after that, the book peels into a little more esotericism, or rather how we think or perceive of sex, as opposed to sort of direct anatomical issues. So I look at penetration, how I was led to believe sex was just penetration. And it took way too long to figure out that actually there's all this other stuff that not only can make you both happy, but can definitely make you happy as like a cisgender woman with a clitoris, because, hey, have you heard of clitoral stimulation and what it can do, kind of thing? And how not leaving much room or not having much conversation around penetrative sex hurts so many groups. Hurts people like me, but it also hurts members of the LGBT plus community who have always had non-penetrative sex. It's just people haven't necessarily given them the space to talk about it or learn much about it. And people with disabilities, again, who have always had non-penetrative sex, and some of whom will be limited to only having non-penetrative sex, but have a very fulfilling sex life. As a society, we can be pretty mean about demeaning that kind of sex when it can be good, if not better. And then I look at myths around sexlessness and how people get really deeply misunderstood for not wanting to have sex, for choosing periods of celibacy. And in the book, I say how much I hate that word. Celibacy has like a history in religious vocation that makes it, especially like in the English language, like it really doesn't feel fitting for the modern era. It doesn't feel fitting for me as a kind of, a young woman leading a pretty liberal life in London. If I wanted to not have sex for 3 months, I don't think I'm celibate. Like I don't identify as celibate. I want a better word, but there kind of just isn't really one. But I look at that, and that includes people who are asexual, and how, that is not celibacy. Do not misunderstand it as celibacy. This is what it is. And this is how it's historically been not only misunderstood, but marginalized, and how asexuals often can be one of the most misunderstood and mistreated, actually, orientations often in LGBT plus groups. And lastly, I look at consent because it's kind of the most zeitgeisty. It's the word that you hear talked about a lot. Sex education programs are like rapidly trying to pivot to covering consent better, because in a British context, we've had lots of reviews into schools about how they're harboring cultures of sexual harassment and assault and aren't doing enough about it. So they're kind of going, oh my goodness, we need consent workshops. And it's like, yeah, like they might be useful, but what else are you doing about the culture of the school? And in this consent workshop, are you literally just scaring young people about rape and assault? Or are you educating them on what power looks like, on what healthy sex and relationships looks like? If you're only teaching them what is bad and you're not teaching them what is good, how on earth are they going to know what's good? How on earth are they going to know what to look out for? And I'll just end this little mini rant on a really cool piece of research that came out this year. So I don't know if I get to write a forward or thing for like my paperback publication of the book, which is out in April, but a piece of research came out that found definitively that pleasure, when it's incorporated into sexual health interventions, improves said sexual health interventions. So like I said right at the beginning about how schools obsess about kind of condoms, don't get pregnant, don't spread STIs, sexually transmitted infections, let's also talk about what does good sex wearing a condom look like? If we talk about that, you might end up with better uptake of people wearing condoms, for example. So we need to incorporate that into conversations as well. But yeah, that's a kind of scattergun look at the myths I address.
I'm curious, you report on both sides of the pond, UK and US. Do you notice any major differences? 'Cause I grew up in the UK, and I went to an all-girls boarding school in the UK. So I'm kind of interested, and I've been in the US for the last 11 years. So I'm curious what your experience of what you've noticed between UK and US.
So the biggest thing that particularly relates to my book is that in the US, you have had a more directed conversation around purity culture and abstinence education, because you've literally had $2 billion of federal funding into abstinence education. And the fact that different states are capable of introducing incredibly variant sex education to the point where plenty of them either only teach abstinence, or they are allowed to leave out consent, or they are allowed to actually be really mean about the LGBT plus community as opposed to educating people healthily about the wide variety of genders and sexualities they may have or indeed encounter in the big wide world. In the UK, the picture's not like that. We have our devolved nations have national curriculums that schools have to stick to. We have had people spread ideas akin to purity culture, but because it's not been federally funded, state funded, it's kind of happened under the surface to the point that we've never had the national conversation decrying it. We never had the Britney Spears, Miley Cyrus, Jonas Brothers, Purity Ring, and then like Disney fallout of all these stars having to, they had to be these virginal stars, and then they become grown-ups and they realize, hang on, I just want to be me. Why are you trying to make me do this? We didn't have any of that in the UK. Whereas both countries do historically come from, very Christian ideologies, but it's manifested very differently over the course of British and American history.
There's more information available in the US, but less conversation. And I find that in the UK, there is less information available, but there's more conversation. I don't know if that's something that resonates with you. I feel like in the UK, we talk about sex more freely, about who you've had sex with and whether you shag someone is kind of more available for conversation, but there isn't as much of this like information, education, pleasure, education, all that kind of stuff isn't so readily available. In the US, it's kind of vice versa. Like there's if you find them, there are plenty of sex educators, there's a lot of information out there. Of course, there's misinformation, disinformation, but it is not as easily, it's not something that you sort of loudly and openly talk about in the pub in the US. I think there are also more books before the content creation tsunami, I think there are also just more books in the US about sex education.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the consequence of the both explicit and insidious narratives that exist around sex. At some point, you referenced it as being at kind of the level of crises and something that we really need to take seriously and have some call to actions around. What are the indicators that help you think we are at a level now where something now needs to be done?
Again, I refer to these phenomenal pieces of data that we have in the UK, which is from a study called NatSal. And it's like this national survey that's done every couple of years to take the temperature of our sexual attitudes and lifestyles. And it found that, let me just think a moment and get this right. I believe it found that 51% of women and 42% of men in the last year have had a sexual problem lasting 3 months or more. So that's over half of women and nearly half of men. Anyone who's had a sexual problem, big or small, or even a relationship problem, right? Separate the sex and we're just talking about relationships, big or small. How much of our lives does it take over? How much of our well-being in that day or week or month does it take over? How does it affect our jobs? How does it affect our mental health or physical health? When you start loading all of that on, you start realizing, oh, hang on a minute. This is a massive health issue. That's strange. Why are, for example, sexual health services being cut when they could be being made better? That's the context we're dealing with in the United Kingdom. We start thinking, hang on, this is so important. And not only is it not being treated as a massive problem, resources are actually being slowly taken away from it. It's when you start thinking of all those layers that you quickly realize, oh, okay, this is how we got here. And we're going to stay here unless we figure out a way to make everyone happier and healthier.
That makes sense to me. I think we did a series at some point around sexual self-esteem and did a mini episode specifically about labias and the impact of, thinking that the color, shape, size of your labia is wrong and the impact of that. And to your point, I think it has effects outside of your physical body. It certainly had effects around your partner choices, but it starts to then seep into power dynamics, what you allow to happen to your body, what you think about in terms of consent and what you're willing to accept because of the way that you think that you look. And so there's so many ways in which we are disembodied and disempowered by thinking that we are wrong. And then to Effy's point, certainly that's how capitalism works, right? That our lives will be better if our hair is shinier. And so that shampoo in that commercial is my pathway to happiness. And so I think that to your earlier note, there's so much that is for those who benefit from it. There is so much to lose, which is clear why they continue to maintain the status quo and why it's important for all of us to undermine that. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what can folks do? What is the call to action? What happens next?
Other than buying your book, of course.
Yeah, other than buying my book.
Right, exactly.
So to start with, reading books like mine. Mine's not the only one. I in fact, there's a suggested reading list at the back of my book. But reading books like mine, especially my one that in each chapter, at the end, I tell you what the truth is. Like, I tell you what the evidence-based story of version of this myth we can tell ourselves is. So, for example, in the first chapter, you as a young person and young people now may have been set up to think of first-time sex as this singular one-time moment where you change overnight. And you go from having value as one person to having a different value after that act. And that's where the conversation starts and ends. And if you start saying to young people, oh, actually, like when researchers want to look at how healthy and happy you are, they don't look at like, how old were you when you lost it? Or who did you lose it with? Or have you lost it? They don't use the vocabulary of virginity or virginity loss to start with, because it's rubbish and we shouldn't be saying those words anymore. But they ask you things like, did you use contraception? Did it happen at the right time for you? Were you equally willing? Did you make this decision autonomously? And when we start looking at it as this kind of decision we make, if we start picturing how it looks and how much pleasure we're deriving from it and the power that we have, that's a far different story that we could be telling young people and ourselves. If we look at penetrative sex, a really brilliant piece of research that didn't come out all that long ago. I believe it came out in 2021. But in the chapter about penetrative sex and how sex does not need to be penetrative or only penetrative, a study was done where basically a bunch of researchers were like, there are loads of heterosexual women who are working out how to orgasm from penetrative sex by ensuring clitoral stimulation is involved. And this is one of my TikToks that you might have seen in my series, Sex Linguistics. But they realized these things that women are doing don't have a name. So if we figure out what they're doing, take the most popular ones and name them, women will not only kind of be able to learn how to do them, but partners will know how to do it with women, for women. You can communicate and you can help fix this kind of heterosexual orgasm gap that exists. So everything about my book is solutions focused. That's really important because otherwise it would be doom and gloom. If you're just sort of talking about this is going wrong and oh, this is also going wrong and people think this is happening and it's not. It has to be solutions focused as well. And the second thing is when you encounter misinformation, what's going to be your digital footprint after it? I'm talking digitally, but this is the same for in person too. If someone says, the next time someone says to me, it felt like throwing a sausage down a corridor, I'm not going to let that pass. I'm going to say something. I'm going to ask them a question and I'm going to try and work out how it was they got to that thought and take it back and be like, oh, did you know that actually blah, 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 blah. And obviously you can only do that from a place of being reasonably well informed. So you start doing these things after you've read books like mine. Digital footprint. You see a TikTok that is saying something completely ridiculous about, let's take, for example, the hymen. Go in those comments and say, you need to read, you can say stuff like read Losing It. You can link them to one of the studies mentioned in Losing It and say, oh, this isn't actually a thing. this is just a widely believed myth. Like, that's why you believe it. That's why I used to believe it. It's not the case. This is actually the reality. What is your digital footprint going to be? Do you want history to remember you? Do you want your web history to remember you as someone who does nothing about misinformation? Or do you want it to remember you as taking a little bit of action that could, I'm not over exaggerating, change someone's life? That is what this information can do. That's all information is. It's bits of material that help us make informed choices about our lives. So when we're given misinformation instead, we aren't empowered to make healthy choices about our lives. We are more likely to make choices that are going to lead to things like negative sexual health outcomes for ourselves and the people that we love around us. We have to do better. We have to make sure that we are making the right decisions and helping other people make the right decisions too.
Yes. I'm just, Effy and I are silently just like nodding over and over. Yes, yes. Yes, all those things. I think what I heard from you is individual self-education, unlearning, and intentional decision-making that may be contrary to what we have learned, and social and political pressure for support and funding. And certainly it sounds like within friendship groups and partnerships and family, shifts in language and conversations, and starting early, starting with the children in our lives and creating space for dialogue that is not just fear-based. We appreciate your time. We are grateful for this conversation, grateful for the work that you do. A huge part of why this podcast exists is in order to change the noise. And so you are doing a great deal to help that happen. And I'm wondering, before we leave you, you shared so much about what we should know about the world of sex positivity and our bodies. I'm wondering if we can spend a few minutes getting to know you a little bit better. And so we have 4 questions that we'd like to ask. And the first is, what is one piece of advice that you would give to your younger self about love, sex, or relationships?
You are in control. And if you don't feel like you're in control, it's because you've not been given enough information. You need to watch a few things and read a few things. And please just do all of that from like evidence-based sources and educators who are widely respected. But you need to self-educate in a way that no one's ever told you to.
Beautiful. What is one romantic or sexual adventure on your bucket list?
Do you know why I find this question hard? Because I don't look at my romantic or sexual life as like not boxes to tick off, but I don't look at it as a list of things I must do by the time I die, kind of thing. I don't look at it like that.
Sure. That's okay. And that's a good enough answer, I think.
But I don't want that to come across as though I am unambitious about it, because I am.
I don't think anybody listening is like, Sophia sounds really unambitious. You've like taken on one of the toughest subjects and wrote a book on it. So I think you're ambitious in the most positive way. And I totally understand you saying, look, I don't have a list of things I'm going to tick off. I just want to like go out there and explore and follow whatever feels good. And then make a list at the end saying, here are the awesome things I did and I liked. So that's okay too.
Like book. That's 25.
Yeah. Nice.
I love it. This feels self-evident, but worth asking. How is it that you challenge the status quo?
Well, I don't only do it with writing about sex and indeed TikToking about sex. I have challenged the status quo a lot in the UK by trying to challenge news media into caring a lot more about like younger audiences. So I've been recognized here for using TikTok and TikTokifying our journalism to better reach young people. Because the status quo in the UK, possibly in the US as well, and in other countries, is that we kind of just assume the news is so important and you should watch it and everyone will come and watch it. And I think that that is really not the case anymore. We need to challenge ourselves as newsmakers and storytellers to do a lot better for young people in busy content feeds. So that's a way I challenge the status quo alongside my work on sex misinformation.
Beautiful. And last but not least, what are you curious about lately?
I am curious about linguistic change. So I am a linguist. That's how I began life aged 18 as a languages student, but I am getting super interested in language and linguistic change after writing Losing It, because there's an example in the book that looks at Sweden and how Sweden changed its word for hymen, because its first word was literally virginity membrane in Swedish. And obviously, you're likely to believe in myths around the hymen if it's literally called virginity membrane. They changed the word, and not only did they change the word to be more neutral and simply mean vaginal crown or vaginal corona, but now fewer young people in Sweden believe in the myth. So it's affected change. And turns out there are other examples like this. So this is my new research area. So keep your eyes peeled if you like languages stuff about sex and about other things, because I keep making content about it over on my TikTok.
Beautiful. And just speaks to me. I'm a big language nerd. Words matter, friends. Words matter.
Agreed. We'll have to have you come back and talk about that, because yes to all of the things. Really appreciate your time. Really appreciate the work that you are doing authentically. I think I have an 11-year-old daughter. And so not only is this important for me, but certainly I think about it as a mom. And so I'm grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you.
If you want to learn more about Sophia Smith Galer, you can find her on TikTok at Sophia Smith Galer and on Twitter at Sophia S. Galer. Her book, Losing It, Sex Education in the 21st Century, is available via our reading list on our website or at your local or online bookstore. If you've enjoyed this episode, if you have questions, if you have strategies to share, or if you just want to connect with other Foxy listeners, then head to Facebook and join our Facebook group at We Are Curious Foxes. We would love for you to save, follow, and share the Curious Fox podcast. Share this episode with folks who would enjoy it so that we all can be a part of changing the noise. And if you're still curious, then you should become a Patreon member for early release of episodes, mini episodes, and content that we could not fit into the show. We have done a refresh to our website. You should go on, take a look. We Are Curious Foxes. You're going to find blog posts, reading lists, past episodes, and so much more. wearecuriousfoxes.com. And let us know that you're listening by sharing a comment, story, question, or an episode idea by emailing us or sending us a voice memo to listening@wearecuriousfoxes.com. Or you can record a question for the show by calling 646-450-9079.
This episode is produced and edited by Nina Pollock, who makes sure the information we distribute is crystal clear. Our intro music is composed by Dev Saha. We are so grateful for their work, and we're grateful to you for listening. As always, stay curious, friends. 3, 2, 1, go. Stopping. Curious Fox Podcast is not and will never be the final word on any topic. We solely aim to encourage curiosity and provide a space for exploration through connection and story. We encourage you to listen with an open and curious mind, and we'll look forward to your feedback. Stay curious, friends.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.